The elderly man with the grey beard didn't fit most people's impressions of the most wanted criminal in Europe. But as Detective Sergeant George Nichols knew full well, appearances could be deceptive. He was staring into the eyes of the fugitive man he had stalked for the last 8 months when he said, "Is your name Lucien Riviere?"
My name is Charles Wells.
You have passed under the name Lucien Riviere in Paris before.
If they like to call me Riviere, very well. Yes, it's me.
Gotcha, bitch!
Do you deny your identity?
Not at all. I can't deny my name. I'm the man the song was about. The man who broke the bank at Monte Carlo. Remember it.
As I walked along the quadrangle with an independent air, could hear the girls declare he must be a millionaire. Could hear them sigh and wish to die and see them wink the other eye at the man who broke the bank at Monte Carlo.
Everyone in that can't remember the song. It was #1 in the chart. It was top of the pops, most famous song in the world at the beginning of the 20th century. But for those of you who weren't born under Queen Victoria rule, here's a TLDR. Charles Wells, born in England, parents moved to France. He grew up, went to Monte Carlo casino to gamble, won a lot of money, got famous. He made a song about him, got old, died. It seems simple, but this story has a few twists and turns. Has a lot of twists and turns, and even a conspiracy theory by the end. So, young Charles was born April 1841 in Broxburn, UK. His father, Charles Jeremiah Wells, was a poet and writer. That he didn't like to work that much, so he enjoyed being outside, fishing and resting. He especially liked beekeeping because he said he could lay down while the bees did all the work. So, not what you would call a hard-working man. But, I mean, he, his wife and children moved to France a few weeks after Charles was born. They sold everything they had and moved to a small commune called Quimper. That's where young Charles grew up sailing, boating and fishing. His first memories were probably divided by the English life he had at home with his family and the life he had outside as a young Frenchman. Some say this created a sense of not really belonging anywhere. His father probably made a big impact on him while growing up. They say he was a powerful and intimidating figure. There's even an account that he raised a girl from the dead. In 1850 they moved to Marseille. It's suspected that the reason for the move may have been for the sunshine and hot air of Marseille that benefited the bronchial illness that young Charles had, but the move probably happened because of a job offer to teach English that Charles Sr. had. Marseille was a much larger city with a very important port full of ships, and Charles watched as steamships began to appear more and more. He was growing up, had dark hair, small stature, was curious to know how things worked, especially with machines, so it's natural that he ended up working with ships. It's said that he was polite and gentle, but had a very verbose way of speaking and writing, and had a habit of exaggerating things. It's something that the people of Marseille are also known for. There's a famous story of a sardine
blocking the port entrance.
It was just a boat named Sardine. He worked with ships, the machines and steam engines without a formal education as an engineer. He was what the French called ingénieur civil, basically just an engineer without a formal degree. They say he wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty and even wore shabby clothes most of the time. To pass the time, he loved being at sea on boats. He also loved music, played piano and organ. He drank alcohol very rarely and never smoked. He then met the daughter of one of the neighbors, Marie-Thérèse Josephine Gertout. They had one child, Marie-Antoinette Florence Charlotte de Villewels. In 1868, at 27 years old, he decided to go freelance. With the help of the Suez Canal, the Marseille port was growing really fast. Sailing ships were difficult to maneuver along the canal, so steamships were in high demand. Around this time, he filed a patent for a device that claimed to be an improvement for regulating the speed of marine steam engines. He spoke English without a French accent. He managed to sell the patent for 5,000 francs, which is like 5 years of his salary at the time. He then traveled the whole world. He worked for a count in Ukraine with a sugar beet refinery and helped him increase the production tenfold. He worked in a Spanish-led mine. He traveled to Austria, traveled to Italy, where he supposedly learned to speak good Italian. He was probably living okay. He and the family still lived in Marseille, but moved to a bigger house. He also helped his parents move to a bigger house. In 1878, he filed another patent for a hygienic high school jug. 1878 is also a special year. It's the year of the Exposition Universelle. This was a famous world's exhibition held in Paris, but not the one with the Eiffel Tower, the one that had the Statue of Liberty on display before being sent to the US of A. This one had the theme New Technologies, tech you may have heard, such as Alexander Graham Bell telephone, Thomas Edison's phonograph and megaphone, prototypes of refrigerators, typewriters, electric candles. There was even a prototype for a steam-powered plane. They were living the steampunk dream. But my favorite was Augustin Mouchot's solar generator. It converted solar heat to power a steam engine that was cooling a chamber that was making ice. We know that he was around Paris at the time, so it's impossible to imagine that he didn't go there. It's now 1879. His mother passed away and his father was living alone in a big house and depressed. The father spent his life trying to have his writings published. He wrote at least one novel, various poems, 3 volumes of short stories and an epic poem. But after his wife passed away, he burned all the manuscripts. But a poem that he wrote long ago in 1850, Joseph and His Brethren, was discovered by the poet Dante Gabriel Rossetti, and he made the poem mandatory reading if you wanted to be part of his entourage, and they had to go all the way to the British Library to find the only copy available. Dante and a few important guys managed to get the poem published again, but the public wasn't interested. Wells Sr. wrote to a friend saying the doors of high society had opened to him, but now he was too old and bedridden. Recognition had come too late. He was once considered a genius by some, and now died poor and unrecognized. Seeing his father live and die like this probably weighed on Charles Wells' next decision. He would now work full-time as an inventor and move to the place with all the opportunities, Paris. Drinking from the city's enthusiasm, he started pumping out inventions left and right, but nothing that got any attention. He even applied a patent for luminous signs, similar to the signs we see everywhere on the roads nowadays. But at the time, without cars on the road, there was no market for them. That was the struggle of the inventor. It could be years to find a buyer for your patent. Sometimes ideas were just too far ahead of their time, or competition got there first, or simply no one wanted to take the financial risk. He sold his first patent fairly easily 10 years ago, but now the fish weren't biting. He was now approaching 40, had worked hard all his life, had applied himself in his career as engineer and inventor, but things weren't going according to plan. He also had a wife and daughter to take care of. Would his life be wasted like his father's, or there was still time to leave his mark on the world? He had watched the example of the count that he previously worked for, a man that lost everything in Poland and emigrated to France, but after a while managed to open a bank and be one of the wealthiest men in Europe. So this example probably gave Charles an idea. He decided to open up a bank. Opening up a bank was much more simple back then. The French had a laissez-faire attitude that translates to who cares? Who gives a banks were viewed as private investments by the owners, so banks were opening and closing all the time. It was like starting an NFT project in 2022. So Charles opened up his bank in the center of Paris and named it Banque Industrielle de France. He sent press releases to the newspapers advertising the intention to invest in solid industries such as manganese, silver, copper, and lead mines instead of the stock exchange. Early on, the newspapers found the name of the bank suspicious. Remove one word and you got Banque de France, the national's bank name. So normally he decided to open up another bank and called it Banque des Arts et Manufactures. Wells went to a struggling financial newspaper and gave them money to publish an ad, masked as an independent article. But because it was him that wrote the article, it was written with a convoluted and almost incomprehensible style. He then showed potential investors the article to improve his credibility. But other newspapers saw through this and published articles warning people of the red flags. But nevertheless, Wells was getting investors and breaking in the dough, eventually moving the bank to 21 Avenue de l'Opéra, a fancier place. Roulette. In the same building, a Belgian financier named Simon Philippard also had an office. This man went around making railway networks, and then, when the construction was complete, the government was legally bound to buy it from him. It was all good until he started to construct railways that competed with the ones that the state already had, so the government told him to. This must have inspired Wells, because in 1883 he decided to diversify his portfolio. He placed an ad inviting the public to buy railway shares in northern France. A small town named Berck-sur-Mer was becoming a popular sea bathing resort. People were going crazy for the fine sandy beach. An ad claimed, "It's only 4 hours from Paris." In truth, it was a 3-hour train ride from Paris to Virton, but then it was a gruesome 4-mile ride made by horse-drawn omnibus that people said felt like torture. Wells proposed to build a line extension to solve this problem. He was seeking investors to this magnificent idea, and sometimes promising more than double the return on investment. People loved to invest in railway shares, sometimes even people with really modest means. Newspapers warned the public that Wells was saying that the investment was government-backed, but because this railway was not officially declared to be public utility, that was a lie. You can probably guess what happened next. The railway was not built, Wells closed both his banks, people lost their money. The police appeared on Avenue de l'Opéra to make an arrest, but wait. In this case, it was to arrest Simon Philippard. He was wanted in Belgium for fraud and falsifying documents. This probably spooked Wells, because after this, he disappeared into thin air, taking within the equivalent to £600,000 in today's money. Banque Industrielle was declared insolvent, and investors got back 15% of the money invested. The French authorities didn't charge Wells with anything regarding the banks, but considered the events with the railway to have been fraudulent, so they opened up an investigation. But since no one could find Wells, there was little they could do except interview the victims. Eventually, a court in Paris found Charles de Wells, they wrote his name wrong, guilty and sentenced him to 2 years in prison, but he was already out of the country. He fled to a place that, as far as we know, he never visited since he was a few weeks old. Plymouth. The UK was experiencing a second wave of growth after the Industrial Revolution, especially with the application of steam power. He went patent mad and registered nearly 100 patents, preserving mustard when mixed, life-saving torpedoes, a combination fire extinguisher grenade with lamp and chandelier. At the time, he just had to pay £1 to register a provisional patent for 9 months, but none of the patents were making money. The months were going by, and he was starting to run low on funds. His wife disapproved of his past shenanigans with the banks. She was accustomed to living a better life in France, and they were now living with their teen daughter with much more modest means. Tired of that, she went back to France with her daughter. He liked Plymouth for being a port city, but because his patent business was going nowhere, he decided to go to the busiest port city in the world in 1887. London. He started renting a poor small single room, but by the end of the year, he was already living in a middle-class house. That's probably because he changed his method. He started an OnlyFans. No, instead of trying to sell the patent, he first sent letters to potential investors, and he would present himself as inventor and engineer, piquing their interest just enough to start a correspondence, drip-feeding information until they got hooked and invested. But around this time, the only patent that got past the provisional stage was a musical skipping rope. He was spending a lot of money with prototypes and was not selling any ideas, nor making any profits to the investors as promised, so he pivoted again. He now was seeking backers before even applying the patent, so instead of just sending letters to rich people, he started buying ads on newspapers with things like, "Fortune. Anyone with a few pounds can secure a large sum, probably a fortune. Though strange in appearance, this is genuine and bona fide, as will be proved to all writing." He experimented advertising with various texts, sometimes asking for 400, 750, 25,000, 50,000, promising different returns, because what could be too much to be true for some could be too little to bother for others. He then responded to the curious people that contacted him with details, but adapted the responses to each person. For example, "Dear madam, the investment would just suit a lady, as there is no further trouble than to cash the share you would have in 8 weeks and the royalty for 14 years. This was the beginning of a letter he sent to Catherine Mary Philip anymore. A really cool lady that was 40 years old lived in a mansion with her old mother and 2 sisters. They had a lot of money, and growing up she had a very good private education at home. The woman at the time didn't go to the university, but on her own she became an expert on Italian art and literature, and by 40 she had written and published 8 books. When her father died a few years ago, he left her millions of pounds and real estate in London, but Wells didn't know that. He was basically just asking her for money to develop the invention, make prototypes before securing the patent, and then he would share a quarter of the profits. But the patent would only be in his name. The particular invention was a fuel-saving device to use in steamships that he said it could save up to 40% in coal. It had great potential because at the time steam engines only achieved 10% of energy efficiency, so if it worked, it could really make a fortune with that. But what really happened was he attracted an investor. They sent him money to register the patent. He sent back an official certificate of patent, asked for more money to work on the prototype. He needed more money, asked for even more money. They kept sending more. He said he was trying to find a buyer, but it was getting to be more difficult than expected, responding to the letters less and less. So this official certificate of patent he sent was in reality just a receipt saying he paid for the registration of the provisional patent, just the £1. But the people never noticed that and thought that it was a legitimate guarantee. After the months went by, most people caught on, but it just wasn't worth it to pay a lawyer to go after him, losing even more money. It's no use throwing good money after bad. Miss Budd, one of the investors, tired of promises and months between letters, contacted the patent office and found out that he only had applied a provisional patent that already expired, and she realized that the patent certificate was a piece of paper without any value. As people like her were piling on, eventually a magazine called Truth published an expose on Wells, warning of his patent schemes. This article and magazine were the brainchild of Henry Labouchere, a guy that studied at Eton and Cambridge, got £500,000 in debt, was kicked out by his parents, went to Mexico, fell in love with a circus performer, joined the circus, at one time lived with an Ojibwe tribe, and then became a well-known journalist with a well-earned reputation for exposing swindles, scandals, and injustices. People like to sue him for defamation, but almost nothing stick to him. Armed at all points, he never strikes till he is certain that the blow will be crushing. Perfectly fearless, he is perhaps the only journalist for whom the law of libel has no terrors. In 1890, he wrote in his column that a lot of people were writing to him, asking him to investigate Charles Wells' dealings. From the outside, it was easy to see that this was a scam that he did over and over. So Labouchere went on publishing articles almost every week, warning the public to beware of Wells' schemes. He even wrote that Scotland Yard should keep an eye on him. Wells probably got a little scared because the amount of ads he published reduced a lot after this. But as far as the authorities were concerned, they weren't that much interested in this case. Probably because fraud is very difficult to prove. He could simply argue that he did not want to defraud anyone and that he believed the ideas would make money. He just couldn't find a buyer. It was just bad luck. In Britain, these types of financial schemes were unregulated. The people that invested the money were the ones responsible to make sure it was a legit business venture. So to get a conviction, they would need to prove that Wells knowingly made false claims about past events. For example, someone saying, "I want to create a beekeeping empire. Invest £10,000 in me and I'll make you a millionaire." If this doesn't happen, it's unfortunate, but not illegal. But saying, "Last year, I made tons of honey. Invest in me and I'll make you a millionaire." If the prosecution can prove the claim of the past event is deliberately untrue and was used to attract the investor, you may have a case, but it's really difficult to prove the intent. On top of that, Scotland Yard was going through a difficult time. The Commissioner of Police had resigned. Officers were being convicted of corruption and they failed to catch them. Jack the Ripper, so they were focusing on cases they were sure would get a conviction. Meanwhile, Miss Phillimore probably didn't see these articles, because she sat waiting patiently for news of developments on her investment. But months passed without words from Wells, and when he responded, it was just to give promises and more promises. Introducing Honourable William Cosby Trench. The young Irish aristocrat was reading the Times when something caught his eye. £25,000 positively paid in 4 months, plus large yearly income, to purchaser of share in an important patent, price £475 down. The young man didn't have any experience with business, but decided to send a letter asking for more details. He received a response from Wells detailing yet another fuel-saving device, but this time for really large ships, and could save up to 60% in fuel, and that even the Navy would be interested in it. Trench was cautious at first, but after some correspondence, he was convinced and sent the customary initial £5 Wells asked to register the patent. In turn, Wells sent back an envelope with an official certificate of patent. He then pressured Trench to send him the rest of the £470 so he could go on developing the idea. But he was suspicious, because the same ad continued to appear on the paper. Wells simply said they were paid in advance and didn't yet run out. Trench eventually sent the rest of the money, but Wells kept on buying new ads, asking for more and more money, promising even more. But they were not getting any responses. No one believed the promises of millions of pounds in return. No one except Trench. So then a peculiar thing happened. Trench saw another ad in the Times that he liked and didn't realize that it was Wells behind it. And Wells didn't realize at first that this was already his client, the Honorable William Cosby Trench. Wells sent a letter almost identical to the first one he had sent to Trench, but this time he was asking for £500. Wells then responded about the first ad, saying that he already made the device and was preparing to test it. Trench then responded saying that a friend also wanted to invest. Then Wells, figuring out what happened, responded, this is good news, because the ship that he tested the device had sunk and they needed more money for a new device. So then Trench sent £500 more to Wells. During this time, Wells was practically only getting money from Trench. The patent scam was drying up. Also around this time, Wells met the love of his life, a young French woman named Jeanette Perry. She liked new clothes, hats, jewelry, shoes. He walked around with an old suit. She liked champagne and fine dining. He liked to eat boiled eggs he prepared. She was 21. He was almost 50. She was a little younger than Charles' daughter. He was a little older than her father. He had a reputation to like the little ladies. He now spent his time traveling around Europe. He needed more money to keep up with Jeanette's expensive tastes and had to think of a new scheme. But in the meantime, he was milking Trench as much as possible. First, he convinced him to buy an additional share for £1,250. Then wrote to him saying he needed another £2,500 to set up a Franco-Belgian company to exploit the patent, but only had £500, and told him it was okay if he didn't have the money available. He could easily get the £2,000 elsewhere, but wanted to give him first refusal. Bear in mind, these two men never met face to face. Trench was confident in the machine, but was not so sure of the profits Wells was promising. But he ended up convinced, and the £2,000 check arrived. Months later, Wells wrote from Turin, saying he was in the middle of forming a large company and asked for more £2,500 of investment. Trench sent the money. Wells sent more share certificates. Then Wells finally invited Trench to London. He was going to do a demonstration of his invention. The demonstration was on the River Thames, in a filthy place filled with pollution from factories, in a small launch that Wells owned. But Trench was so focused on listening to Wells talking about the company he was going to open in France that he forgot to see if the boat was using more or less coal. He didn't even look at the invention that was supposed to reduce the fuel used. Poor Honorable Trench was now the main source of income for Wells. He had invested a total of £6,750, by a long shot, the person that invested the most. Wells had a lot of expenses, big houses, big business offices, several yachts, Jeanette shopping bills, employees, a lot of it to keep appearances. But the investors were getting impatient. One time Miss Phillimore even went knocking at the door of his office, but went away without seeing him. He wasn't there. Wells was more focused on impressing Jeanette. His latest project was acquiring a gigantic vessel. A shady character found a former cargo ship for sale. It had steam power and a full set of sails. The idea was to convert it into a large pleasure craft, but it needed a lot of work and money. £3,500 just to purchase it. Wells had a new scheme in mind that could pay for all this, but he needed £6,000 in startup capital. He published an ad in the papers asking for a loan of £75. That's 80 people responding to get the £6,000. But nevertheless, even before the ad was published, Wells by some miracle had managed to acquire £4,000 and was on his way to the place that would be associated with him forever. Monte Carlo.
It's the 28th of July, 1891. It's the summer, the off-season for Monte Carlo, because of the unbearable heat, especially with the way Victorians dressed. It's the middle of the day when Charles Wells was crossing the Place du Casino and walking up the stairs, while the two men at the door tried their game of figuring out people's nationality only by their appearance. In this case, they thought he probably was low-born, was an eccentric, or an Englishman, or maybe all of the above. Respectable people didn't go to the casino during the day. But Wells didn't care about that. He wanted to play for the longest time possible without interruption, so he went as early as he could. He enters the fancy room that's fancily decorated and sits on a fancy chair. with velvet cushions. At the roulette table, the croupiers, looking at him like they were looking at an insect, said without expression, "Faites vos jeux, monsieur. Gentlemen, place your bets." Wells starts to place small gold coins on the table. Chips were not used at the time. Bets were made with coins or banknotes. The croupier makes the wheel spin and throws the ivory ball. The wheel barely begins to slow down when he says, "Les jeux sont faits." The bets have been placed. Rien ne va plus. No more bets accepted. The wheel slows even more until it stops on a numbered slot. This cycle takes about a minute, and the casino will do this over and over until closing time. He put his £4,000 to work, betting like a millionaire that didn't care if he lost the money. But after a while, the banknotes started piling in front of him. The table was now full. People started whispering, gathering around to watch, then shouting loudly. A crowd formed. Everyone wanted a better look at how this man was winning so much. There was so much people around the table wanting to mirror Charles' bets that people pushed and shoved each other. The croupiers could only limit the number of players at the table. It was getting difficult to keep up with so many people betting, and without the use of chips, they had a hard time figuring out who won what. The croupiers reported at one time that the crowd was 8 rows packed full of people around the table. It was like a Black Friday type of deal. Charles was not affected by this. He continued to place his bets with a cool head. The air was getting unbreathable, but he didn't care. Other people were getting outside to breathe fresh air, eating and drinking something, but he never left his seat. The owner and director of the casino for the past 10 years sensed something was fishy. He would usually watch the gaming hall from a disguised peephole in the wall, but this time it was getting difficult to see what was going on. Voices commotion around this normal-looking man. If we go back 30 years, we find Camille Blanc's father, François Blanc, saving the casino from bankruptcy and turning it into a multi-millionaire's business. When François was young, he traveled around Europe with his twin brother. They loved to go to all the different casinos, but they soon realized that the casino is the only one that makes the real money. If we cannot earn good living as gamblers, we shall start our own casino. To do that, they prepared a scheme that exploited the slow speed of information. Bear in mind that there were no telephones, no MySpace, and the telegraph was around, but only for relative short distances. So imagine you are at the Paris stock market and they announce that the price of a stock has gone up. If you are, for example, in the south of France, it could be almost a day until the information arrived there. So if they somehow could get the information first, they could buy stock at a lower price, knowing that it was gonna go up in a few hours. To transmit this type of information, the government used an optical telegraph. It was a network of towers with pivoting arms that created shapes in order to transmit messages from one tower to another. So they just went to one of the towers and bribed some guys. Easy. The scheme only ended when one of the accomplices was dying and confessed it on his deathbed. Luckily for them, they only had to pay a small fine for bribery and were set free, with almost all the money they gained. Gambling was now illegal almost everywhere, but they managed to use their ill-gotten money to open up a casino in
Bad Homburg.
It was a small and independent place, governed by accounts. They made a partnership with them. They could open the casino there, but had to share the profits. People went there from all over Europe. They got a lot of publicity, especially when VIPs won a lot of money. One time, Prince Charles Lucien Bonaparte, Napoleon's nephew, won so much money that almost left the casino bankrupt. But this stunt got so much attention that they quickly made their money back, with people trying to do the same but losing. François Blanc understood the power of marketing, so he invented the breaking the bank shtick. But you may ask,
Well, what the hell does breaking the bank mean?
faire sauter la banque, as they said, was when you won so much at one table that they had to close it down to get more money. But they turned this thing into a theatrical event. The croupiers would get a black crepe tablecloth to cover the table, with all the ceremony of a funeral. The table was left like this, while they would go fetch more banknotes. The players usually waited by playing at another tables. François Blanc and the casino got loaded with money until Bad Homburg was absorbed by the Prussian Empire. The problem was, you guessed it, gambling was now illegal, but lucky for François, another aristocrat was looking for an easy life. The Prince of Monaco, Charles III. Monte Carlo already had a casino, but it went bankrupt with lack of customers. The main reason may have been because Monaco was not yet connected to the rest of the French railway system. People say that sometimes business was so slow that the croupiers would stand outside on top of the hill, looking through a telescope, trying to see if anyone was coming up. François Blanc approached the prince and offered to take over the bankrupt casino. The prince accepted, but on the condition the casino paid £1 million every year to the royal household. Also, the casino would would be responsible for public expenses, maintaining the roads, schools, hospitals, police, everything. The citizens of Monaco didn't even need to pay taxes. The casino did so well that one time they even helped the French government when they didn't have the funds to complete the Charles de Carnier Opera House. François used this to gain leverage with the French government and made them finally connect Monte Carlo to the French railway system. When François died, he left 300 million pounds, and on his deathbed, he said the only regret he had was not leaving even more for his family. That's when Camille Blanc took over his father's business, and in 1891, when Charles Wells got there, Monte Carlo was the only place where you could gamble in Europe. Well, at least the only place where it was legal. This meant that Camille inherited a license to print money, but he had to watch his back. 19th century society wasn't very tolerant of gambling. The Times wrote about the Monte Carlo casino, calling it a blot on civilization and a gambling hell. The Vatican and the Church of England were joining forces like a megazord, with a petition to close all gambling salons. Queen Victoria herself thought the casino was an abomination. It's funny because her son Bertie, that would be the next king, often appeared on newspapers that wag their finger at him for going to such places. But he got nothing of today's royals. Newspapers were full of stories of people facing bankruptcy after going there, some even putting an end to it by their hands. So naturally, the casino had an annual budget of £10,000. To make these stories just disappear, a little bit of bribe money here and there can bury a lot. But then, Prince Charles III died. The problem was, his successor, Prince Albert I, didn't share his father's relaxed attitude with the casino. He had moral qualms about living off other people's suffering and misfortune, and also happened to be married to a very wealthy American, so they had financial freedom to stick to their morals with ease. They had plans to turn the casino into an hospital. The contract his father made long ago was in danger. By closing time, Charles had broken the bank. He transformed the £4,000 he entered with into 10,000. He was finally outside, breathing the cool evening air, scented by oleanders and tangerine trees. In the morning he went down to a bank to deposit the extra money he made, and then, at opening time, he was entering the casino to do it all again, gambling all day with no breaks. When I first read that Charles Wells stayed seated for that many hours straight, without breaks and without going to the bathroom, I kinda didn't believe it. But then I remembered my own experience of working in a shitty retail job. The store packed full of people. Sometimes we worked for 9 hours. We were so busy that sometimes we forgot to go to the bathroom. By the end of his 5-day stay, he claims to have won a total of £40,000. At the same time he was packing his bags, a Reuters report was on its way to newspapers all around the world. It said the Monte Carlo casino was going to close next year. Prince Albert had decided to renounce his by now £50,000 salary. News of what happened with Charles Wells were published in the UK. They were saying a fellow lucky Englishman had won big at Monte Carlo. Most people fantasized about doing the same thing he did. Most people didn't have the means to go to Monte Carlo, or the mental strength to go at it like he did, never losing his cool. Even when he lost some, his reputation was getting to America, to Australia, and everywhere it went, people speculated. How did he do it? Surely it wasn't just luck. People thought he had a system and wanted to know what it was. In a few days, he gathered more recognition around the world than his father in his entire life. With the money he won, he put the patent business on hold. He had another inspired idea. He would use his fame as the man who broke the bank in Monte Carlo and place ads on newspapers asking people for gambling money. They would invest $6,000, and if he won, he would send $30,000 back. If he lost, they would only lose the $6,000. As shady as this is, this wasn't illegal. He probably wasn't expecting a lot of replies, because £6,000 is money that most people don't have. But when he was opening one letter, he suddenly realized that this was Miss Phillimore. 2 years passed since she sent him £60. With all the things he had going on, he had forgotten her. She also had been more concerned with caring for her aging mother, but now she had responded to this ad. He then realized that she probably had a lot more money than he imagined. Wells told her about his Monte Carlo escapade and tried convincing her to loan him £6,000, but she was horrified. She was a devout Christian who despised gambling. He then quickly pivoted and said he only did that to finance the large projects he was doing. He told her he had a new fuel-saving device that he was planning to use on a large cargo ship he was going to buy. He also informed her of his new business address that had a few floors filled with machinery, a chemical lab and testing department, rooms for the design of the patents, and an electrical department. He said that he already had 30 ships under his control and said that when he fitted the fuel-saving device, a single voyage would get him a return of £150. She eventually was convinced and loaned him the £6,000, but on the condition he couldn't use the money to gamble. Another person that responded to the ads was good old Trench. He already knew what he did in Monte Carlo, but responding to this ad, he had no idea this was Wells. Because Trench already knew of the Monte Carlo story in detail, he didn't pretend the money wasn't for gambling again. He told him he got a foolproof system he learned while in touring, perfecting an invention, and that he only left Monte Carlo to continue perfecting the invention Trench was backing. This time Trench didn't send any more money. He didn't like the idea of a person gambling with his money. Wells then went on with the thing that made him go to Monte Carlo in the first place, buying a gigantic vessel. He bought the Tycho Brahe, an old and rundown cargo ship. He got a captain and sent him to Liverpool to do extensive renovations that would cost him £20,000. The plan was to transform the old cargo areas into living spaces, a saloon, opulent cabins for Wells and his companions. But the pièce de résistance would be the ballroom that would be 50 feet long and 32 feet wide. Back then, owning a yacht was even rarer than today. Only 4,000 people around the world had one, and of this size, only emperors, queens and kings. He renamed the yacht as Palais Royal. It was for him and his Jeanette. During the renovations, he would frequently go to Liverpool to see the progress. He had a reputation for being always accompanied by young women that he referred to as his nieces. People saw big parties and champagne, but he never drank. They also saw him with Jeanette, which he also said it was his niece. In November, Wells returned to Monte Carlo. Since his last visit, Camille Blanc and the Prince of Monaco reached an agreement to keep the casino open. They finally found a number for the prince's morals. Wells now saw the casino filled with people, and even more in the next few days. When news spread that he was there again, he was reaching celebrity status.
The Monte Carlo Wells.
He gambled for a few days, in a few different games, but one afternoon he was losing more than usual and decided to stop. In the end, the profit of the second visit was £20,000. This time the British press managed to get there before he went home and got to interview him. They wanted to know his name, and he told them Charles Hill Wells, probably because the Charles Will Wells was still wanted by the police in France. He told the newspapers that he followed the table and watched for recurring numbers, then betted the maximum allowed amount each time, without fear and without getting excited, just a cool, calculated manner. When winning or losing, they asked him, why didn't he just bankrupt the casino?
Because the physical strain is beyond my strength. I have been sitting daily from 12 noon till 11 at night, playing without a break, and I am worn out. But I have decided to come again shortly. I have implicit faith in my system, and am perfectly sure I can win again.
The reporter from the Times was skeptical of the claim that he invented a new gambling system, and after watching him, the only novel thing he found was his nerves of steel to bet large amounts over and over. Wells bought £2,000 in casino shares. He said it was a good investment because the house always wins against ordinary gamblers. Blanc managed to renew the contract with the prince and expanded the casino with a new gaming room that was even more lavish. People were coming to Monte Carlo in droves, especially from Britain, where the story got more attention. Hotels were filled and people were playing big sums. Back in London, Labouchere was still printing articles about Charles Wells, the patent scammer, but he probably didn't make the connection to the Monte Carlo Wells yet. It was the Evening News that put two and two together and wrote that the Monte Carlo Wells and the Charles Wells fraudster were one and the same. This caused his investors and creditors to go. He even wrote to Miss Fillmore saying he was sick and would soon send her a check. But the day after the letter was sent, he went to Monte Carlo again. That's the third time. But this time he was accompanied by his wife and his now 25-year-old daughter. It looked like they reconciled after 6 years. There's speculation that they reconciled over Christmas, and since now he had enough money to stop the illegal activities, she would welcome him back. But no more Jeanette, of course. That probably was the most difficult thing for him. They supposedly had a really strong bond. But this time though, when he got to the table, he found Camille Blanc there. Maybe as an intimidation tactic. The thing is, he lost. And a lot. He would continue his tactic of playing the maximum allowed, sometimes racking up a good amount, but ended up losing everything. He said he probably lost around £4,000 in that visit, and having his wife there worrying about his health, making him take breaks and eating something, would cause him to lose focus. The reporter said he had lost a lot of weight, so maybe he was really sick with something, and his wife was caring for him. Previously being praised by the newspapers, they now printed bad things about him, saying that he was just another story of a gambler that eventually loses his luck, and the desire of gambling is never satisfied. They tried portraying him as a low-born, vulgar, cockney non-entity, and even said that his French, and I quote,
was confined to the more obvious parts of the menu card.
I mean, he was a native French speaker. He could speak better French than all those British reporters. And he also had what you would call a genteel upbringing. He knew how to dress up and how to act when the occasion required it. But this type of reports only aided his reputation as a hero to the common man.
As I walk along the Bois Boulogne with an independent air, you can hear the girls declare, he must be a millionaire.
Walk along the Bois Boulogne with an independent air. You can hear the girls exclaim,
He must be a millionaire. You can hear them sigh and wish that I could see them wink the other eye.
But the man who broke the bank in Monte Carlo.
He was in the public mind for those few months, but they probably would have forgotten him like last week's flame war if it wasn't for Fred Gilbert. He was walking by a newspaper stand when he saw the phrase, "the man who broke the bank at Monte Carlo." The words got stuck in his head. The next day, he wrote a song with them. He was a theatrical agent that wrote songs on the side, but nothing successful enough for him to quit his day job. But this time, he thought he had a hit on his hands. His father was a music hall comedian. Music hall is a term used to describe a type of variety show, very popular during the Victorian era. Mostly people performing popular songs, comedy acts, and a lot of specialty acts, ranging from escapology, magic, knife throwing, mimes, shadow puppet, ventriloquist. You get the idea. So Fred Gilbert had connections with the music hall scene, and he tried selling the rights for the song to music hall singers, but no one wanted it. He then approached Charles Coburn, also a music hall singer, who, quote, liked the tune very much, especially the chorus, but he said he was afraid that the lyrics were too highbrow for the type of public he had. Things like Sunny Southern Shore, Grand Triumphant Arch. He didn't say that to put down the public. He was an East Ender himself, so he thought he knew what that public liked to hear, so he said no. But a few hours later, he came back running because he couldn't take the song out of his head. He bought the singing rights for £10 right then and there. His views on the literacy of the common Victorian were a bit outdated. The education system had improved a lot, public libraries were common, newspapers were everywhere and were dirt cheap. The song let the people dream, imagining a commoner like them sitting at the table, playing among royals and millionaires. It was like he was winning for their team. Overnight, the song was the #1 hit for a whole generation. The song crossed the Atlantic and reached the vaudeville acts in the US. Wells was immortalized, but the people mostly knew about the legend, not the actual person. But at the height of his fame, he was in trouble. Financial trouble. He had just lost a lot of money at Monte Carlo. Palais Royal was sucking a lot of money. He managed to get a £1,500 check from Miss Phillimore, who probably just wanted to be left alone since her mother had just died. He also managed another £1,500 from Trench, who visited the Palais Royal and saw them putting the finishing touches on the renovations before the yacht caught fire. It survived, but needed a lot of repairs. He told Miss Phillimore and Trench he needed even more money to repair the ship, since the insurance company was not paying for everything. We don't know if that was true, or just another way to get money. He was justifying the investment in the yacht as fundamental to their business. He would use it to show off the inventions and receive company promoters and government officials on board. At this time, He was also taken to court by Emily Forrester, who 3 years earlier had invested £30 in one of his patents. They argued he used the money to gamble, and the whole thing was a scam. But the judge didn't find enough proof that a fraud was committed, that the action was premature, that there was still a chance that she could get a return on the investment. He was sucking Miss Phillimore dry, sending her share certificates that were just pieces of paper, until she decided to consult with her brother, Sir Walter Phillimore, who was a judge. They then sent a solicitor after him. He was pressuring Trench, saying that the companies were not limited
shareholders are responsible
and needed £10,000, or else he could be liable for the debts of £50,000 in a few days. As you know, Trench wasn't experienced in these matters, but he finally felt something was wrong. He consulted the solicitor and confronted Wells, and at one point Trench lost his temper and almost punched Wells, who begged not to hit him. He was just a family man and didn't mind being punched by the law. One time, the lawyer was investigating the offices Wells claimed he had and only found empty places or places with old furniture. He even appeared at a company meeting in a hotel where he found Wells accompanied by a lot of nieces. So Trench and Phillimore were out. He was desperate. He went back to advertising patent scams with even bigger claims. Frederick Blake was his next victim, a young clergyman. Wells followed the same scheme. Register the patent, blah blah blah, sending the shares, more money, blah blah blah, blackmail, saying he had to give more money, he would be liable for a gigantic sum of money, but he declined. This was the only guy who took the bait in a long while, but even he bailed. The Truth published an article exposing all the known swindles from Charles Wells to the public and urging everyone to get the Monte Carlo Wells to court. So that's what a man named Harris did. It was after £240 that he gave Wells. Wells's lawyer wanted to settle the case there and pay the money, but the judge decided this was a matter for the criminal courts. And apparently, when Wells left the court, various people were waiting for him. He even got punched in the eye by one of them. He knew the jig was up. He went straight to the bank and withdrew £5,000, leaving a balance of 5 shillings. He then went straight to Paddington Station to catch the first train to Plymouth, where Jeanette was waiting for him aboard the Palais Royal. He wanted to flee to Lisbon, since Portugal didn't have extradition agreements with Britain. But because the crew were not authorized to go there, they fled to France instead. Apparently, they were so strapped for cash, they were selling coal by the ship when 2 French detectives appeared to arrest Wells. Who am I? It's for you to find out. They had a description of a 50-year-old Englishman, 5 feet and 4 inches, very bald, with hair and beard turning grey and a black eye. They thought it couldn't be him because his French was so good, but alas, they arrested him and Jeanette. He ended up admitting who he was and boasting about breaking the bank at Monte Carlo, though he only had 24 francs in his pocket. The French didn't pay much attention to the whole Monte Carlo story, but news of a 50-year-old Englishman aboard a gigantic vessel being arrested with his niece. No, that was spicy news for the French. News of the arrest also reached the UK.
The darling of the hour had been arrested.
On Wells' mind were the crimes he had committed in France years ago, so he didn't fight the extradition to England. He probably thought he had a better chance of being acquitted there. On the 12th of December, he would be handed over to the British police, but some documents necessary for the extradition hadn't arrived from London. The next day, a local man wanted to visit Wells in his cell. Turns out Wells made an unfortunate decision when he decided to dock at Le Havre. The man wanting to talk with him was a sea captain at Le Havre, who 10 years back invested in the phony Paris-sur-Mer railway. He identified Wells on the spot. The British detectives arrived prepared to take Wells, but now the French authorities knew this was the Charles the Wheel Wells they sentenced years ago. But the statute of limitations for those crimes was 10 years, and some of them had just passed the 10-year mark. The French deliberated for a few months, but in the end, they decided they probably couldn't get a conviction, so they didn't proceed with the case. Wells was sitting at Le Havre prison. It was a cold night. Wells had chronic bronchitis. The River Seine was frozen. There was heavy snow all over northern France. His most precious possession, the Palais Royal, was being stripped of the eccentric furniture to be sold as a normal cargo ship again. The guy who made the Palais Royal cruise uniform wasn't paid for the work, so he petitioned for the bankruptcy of Wells. 2 British detectives came again with a boatload of documents to bring Wells back, but he was so ill from bronchitis they had to wait for 2 days. But when those 2 days passed, the French authorities handed him to Scotland Yard, along with papers they found aboard the Palais Royal. On the journey back to England, they informed him of the 24 warrants, some for fraud, but others were for theft. He was shaken, because he only had knowledge of the fraud charges, and larceny is much easier to prove and could go up to 14 years in jail time. At the preliminary hearing, it was the first time that Miss Phillimore and her brother looked Wells in the eyes. He was accused of using the money he gained with the patent frauds to gamble. Miss Phillimore came to the stand and said that she never saw a penny back, only pieces of paper with shares. Then came the Honorable William Cosby Trench. He was described by contemporaries as a gentleman of youthful appearance, with considerably more money than sense. Then came the captain of the Palais Royal, who testified that he saw him accompanied by his several nieces. The judge replied,
I don't suppose there were any uncles.
But the second engineer said he always saw Mr. Charles Wells with Jeanette, and that he was a, quote, very plain living man, so who knows. Wells said the ship's intention was to demonstrate the fuel-saving invention, but the captain said the engines were very old, and there was nothing novel about them. In the end, the judge sent Wells to trial. He would appear on the 9th of March 1893 in court. It was packed with curious people. A lot of witnesses said they never saw their money back. At one time, the defense attorney tried distracting the jury by speaking of Wells's great intellect and the system he created, and that he would now tell all about it. No, gentlemen of the jury, I will not tell you this system. If I were to do so, you may desert your wives and families. My learned friends might sell their wigs and gowns, and even my lord, who adorns the bench, might suddenly desert it to make of us some of money. No, gentlemen, I will not tell you. When the court adjourned for lunch, the judge called him aside.
Do you know that system?
No, Judge.
I thought so,
said the judge with disgust on his face. Then came a defense witness, engineer Alexander Ferguson, and he at length and with great detail explained with a strong German accent. Here comes a triple crankshaft, about 3 inch, and another with the 3 inch, so as the middle one is acted with the piston, and by working him down to the power is gained, so as you get so much more power as with the double size of engine. Quite so, responded Wells' attorney. Everyone laughed.
This case may last forever. I may be dead before it's all over.
They indeed had a lot to go through, but when it was time for a jury deliberation, they only needed 1 minute to reach the decision. Guilty. The judge sentenced him to 8 years in prison, adding that it had been a very cruel, very wide scheme. The expression on Wells's face was of surprise. Wells' attorney wrote in his memoirs that he was hoping that it could reduce his client's sentence, but the disappointment he created when he could not reveal the scheme may have done even worse. The myth about Charles grew even larger in the paper. Some continued maintaining a Robin Hood quality about him. All the claims combined amounted to more than £30,000. Miss Phillimore entrenched with the majority of the percentage. They first had to confirm his identity because of the whole Hill Wells versus DeVille Wells. Then he said that he won £60,000 in total at the casino and had 20,000 in shares. He also said he had a very heavy loss because of his wife being there, causing a lack of focus. He wasn't able to do his system properly. They asked him if the system could be reduced to writing. I think so, he replied.
We cannot very well go into that.
I ask, sir, because it might be a valuable asset. When they asked how he got the money to go there the first time, he said he got it from a backer named Miss Lizzie Ritchie. But as far as we know, this is just a made-up person who even appeared as far back as the musical skipping rope patent. He even used that name when some of his friends sent a letter from Vienna posing as her to Queen Victoria, pleading for a pardon for his uncle, who was the last thing this poor orphan had, and the sorrow was killing him. The Queen's secretary forwarded the letter to the Home Office. They didn't find any trace that this person existed, so they didn't take any further action. Up until the bankruptcy court, he was jailed at a relatively easygoing prison in London, but now it was time to do his sentence in hell. Portland. Not that one. Portland in Dorset. They say that your will to live diminished as you were on a bus, chained to other inmates, while watching the grey stones of the prison coming closer and closer on top of the cliff. As a welcome present, everyone got solitary for the first 9 months, and then they would reprimand you for everything, smiling, looking at the sky. At night, every sigh, every prayer, every groan could be heard throughout the whole prison. They were searched 4 times a day, and all the letters were read by the guards. Every month, they did a full random inspection, including stripping down, bending forward until you touched your toes, or a full random inspection. The day started at 5 a.m. and consisted of hard labor, most of them at the quarries, breaking stones, interrupted by pauses to eat horrible food until bed at 8 p.m. August 1894, Charles wrote to his lawyer begging him to track down Monsieur Thibault, who he said owed him £30,000, and get him out of there. He was eventually doing easier work, such as bookbinding. The world outside was changing fast. Motor cars were appearing. The Lumiere brothers debuted their picture show. The Tower Bridge opened. There was a bicycle craze. Slums were cleared, and inventions that were futuristic a few years ago were everyday items, such as cameras, telephones, and phonographs. Charles was missing out. He also missed his daughter's wedding, but his daughter never forgot him. 2 years after the marriage, the husband wrote to the British Home Secretary pleading for his release. In 1899, they cut 2 years of his sentence, and it was time to get out. Before getting out, he started playing the organ on Sundays, and they say he even played The Man Who Broke the Bank at Monte Carlo at the end of service. People came to the railway station to see him return to London as a free man. He told the press he used this time to create a new and improved system that required £6,000, and that he still had £20,000. He in fact stayed at a luxurious hotel, but that was probably arranged by the journalists. They also reported that he was dependent on a niece who helped him during his imprisonment. Jeanette had to support herself, but managed to get by with menial jobs, until she got a job as a lady's maid for a rich and young socialite, Zalma Bradley Lee, and was her confidant and friend. Wells applied for a discharge of his bankruptcy, but the debt was £35,000, and he only had £88 to his name. Even the Palais Royal was sold for a lot less than he paid for, only £4,500. After a few weeks as a free man, he left for Paris with Jeanette. He still had the type of fame that when a child asked for money, someone would usually reply, "Who do you think I am, the man who broke the bank at Monte Carlo?" When they arrived in Paris, they stayed in a very expensive neighborhood. In 1900, the Eiffel Tower was already becoming a symbol, and there was another Exposition Universelle in Paris. Probably inspired by that, he started again to register patents, but this time really kooky ones. He registered in Belgium 7 patents at once: a walking stick, luggage trolley, a speaking clock that would play a recorded message with a phonograph, etc. He was just doing the scam he knew what to do, but before the authorities in Belgium and France snatched him, he and Jeanette fled to Ireland, to the small coastal village of Arrakista. It was the ideal place for them to find peace and quiet, and so they assumed the names of William and Lily Davenport. Wells recruited a man to build a small cottage. It appeared they were there to stay. He also purchased a yacht and a few boats to go fishing. But he quickly got an itch. A scammy itch. He went to France under the name Louis Servatel, opened a company, attracted investors, and disappeared. The funny thing is, when they looked for a Louis Servatel, he had in his records that he was born in the town of Saint-Pierre on the Martinique island, a town where a massive volcano eruption killed most people there and wiped all the records. So in 1905, Servatel, without getting caught, was sentenced to 3 years. But at that time, was already on a boat fishing with Jeanette as the Davenport couple again. That same year, London held a naval, shipping and fisheries exhibition, and guess who was there? Reverend Vivian Henry Moyle, a clergyman who went to Oxford and also 7 years in prison for forgery, and his new accomplice, Wells. Both of them shared a passion for scams. They were demonstrating a life-saving device that Wells invented. They had a demonstration with a Japanese doll in a glass case as the victim. They had a series of tubes that pumped air in and out and made the doll breathe. Moyle stood dressed in clerical garb, saying that this apparatus could save lives, or even bring ones back from the dead. But predictably, this was just the old scheme to attract investors and then run. They bought a rusted and worn old steamship. They posted ads to invest in them, passing as if they ran a syndicate of fishing ships. When Alfred Emmanuel saw the ads, he knew right away the game. He himself was a scammer, but his latest ploy was using his first-hand knowledge of scams. He spotted the scammers in the newspapers and blackmailed them, threatening to write to newspapers exposing them. and instead offering to share a list of clients that were good for those type of scams and obviously would take a cut. So when he saw the ad for the fishing and trawling syndicate, he contacted our Davenport and they made a deal. He would supply a list of 500 potential clients and would get 2.5% of the money. He also wrote favorable articles in newspapers, where he was the financial editor. Wells was running around in London with this scheme while Jeanette stayed in Ireland. But one time she wrote to him that all she ever wanted was for them to retire and live in peace in the south of France, urging him to finish this scheme. He wrote back saying how many mackerel he was catching, but they were worried about how much money they could squeeze before the jig was up again. In fact, the newspapers were catching on. Even Labouchere wrote an article on the fishing trawling syndicate, and that made the police investigate Moyle, who had a police record, and they eventually arrest him alongside Davenport. Emmanuel was interviewed by the police but not arrested. He probably ratted them out and got away free. Wells was now again in a cell, probably regretting working with accomplices, a thing he never done before. The court figured out that Davenport was really the Monte Carlo Wells. News flew everywhere. He pleaded guilty. He ended up serving 2 years at Dartmoor prison.
Wells was now 65 years old. This was the second time he was in prison, but instead of breaking stones in a quarry like last time, he did lighter things like helping out in the tailor's shop. Jeanette and Wells kept a close relationship through all of this. Jeanette visited him when possible. He wrote her letters telling how much he missed the touch of golden tresses flowing through my fingers. All of the letters going in and out of the prison were inspected, and one of those that Charles wrote to Jeanette reached the prison governor, Basil Thompson.
He was an intelligent guy that traveled a lot, working in the British colonies, and eventually got promoted to Deputy Prime Minister in Tonga. But his wife got sick, so they moved back to Britain, and he now found himself as the Dartmoor prison governor. He liked to know all the prisoners in his care, even the ones that didn't make any trouble. He liked to reward the prisoners that showed good behavior, and felt that he was rewarded with a better overall atmosphere inside the prison because of that.
So Thompson had this to say about the letter he read from Wells.
The writer represented himself to be in the best of all possible worlds, where the food was excellent, the warders kind and considerate, the work congenial, and the library full of interesting books.
Thompson summoned Wells to his office, and Thompson asked him why he never got any report on him, nor any application. Wells said he didn't want to bother him, that the librarian was very kind to him, and that he was now studying Dickens, which he never had the time to read before. He in fact had access to a library with 3,000 books that were updated all the time, and recently included a lot of Sir Walter Scott and Charles Dickens. It seemed that even Thompson fell into the spell of Charles Wells. One time he wrote this about him.
At intervals of about 3 months he would appear, and I could not help the feeling that the air of that gloomy place was brightened every time he came.
He was now 67 years old when he got out. Jeanette had stood beside him for almost 20 years and made money to support herself. The south of France was still on her mind, but Wells had other ideas first. He went to Paris as Ernest Cuvillier, pretended to be 10 years younger, and was seen with an 18-year-old niece that everyone knew was his mistress. He then mounted a new scheme, probably inspired by all the books he read while in prison. He launched a travel company, the Touriste Universel Centenaire. He wrote a 40-page brochure that was like a fantastic novel, full of convoluted phrases and ideas. He offered cruises around, all expenses paid, for a bargain price. He said this was possible because of the donation of an old foundation created by the families of deceased soldiers during the Battle of Castelfidardo in 1860 Italy. They saved 11 million francs that accumulated interest over 50 years, until they had grown to 88 million. Then, a descendant of the families was ill with a broken heart, a love affair gone wrong. Someone recommended him to go on holiday. He went on a war cruise, and when he returned, he was completely cured and lived to be 100. The families were so happy that they decided to use the money in favor of humanity, subsidizing holiday cruises. I don't know how, but people fell for this, until the police raided his office and arrested him. Jeanette, hearing this, married the guy and went to America. So much for the love story. Charles managed to conceal his identity at the trial, saying he lost his memory. The French judge even made fun of him for only making £280 from the swindle.
He then sent him to 2 years in prison, one of the toughest prisons in France at the time. He was released in June 1910 and was now in Paris without money. Jeanette divorced the other guy and joined Charles. Love prevails. He knew that for the next swindle, he needed a way to make money faster and get away even faster. He returned to Avenue de l'Opéra and assumed the name Lucien Rivière. He then printed a lot of leaflets. 1% guaranteed every day. Stock exchange. The only establishment guaranteeing profits. 15% paid twice a month. The least initiated person in the affairs of the stock exchange. The profits from our systems with Do not judge without seeing the proof. Study the explanatory leaflet, which will be sent free of charge. Minimum accepted 25 francs. Maximum 100,000. La rente bimensuelle. Fortnightly dividend. Right to 1 Place Beaulieu. Second arrondissement. Stock exchange. So I guess this was a Ponzi scheme before it was cool. Since he paid back the profits to the investors with money coming in from new investors, it was really easy to attract more and more people. Some even begged him to invest more than the maximum allowed. A lot of poor farmers and working people, but also a lot of rich priests. The police were looking, but weren't sure there was any fraud going on. Charles and Jeanette bought 17,000 pounds of annuities on Charles' life, which made them 2,200 pounds per year in interest. But then, Sûreté Nationale sent Detective Inspector Jean Roux to investigate the bank. He was part of an elite squad that dealt with assassinations and important thefts. In a recent job, he went undercover as a priest to catch a gang of crooks. On the 18th of April, Jean Roux went to the Rente Bimensuelle headquarters. He was received by a dapper Lucien Rivière. He questioned Rivière and he gave him satisfactory answers. But with his experience, he sensed something was amiss and summoned the banker to appear in his office the next day. That evening, Rivière left the apartment. "I'm going out," he said to the office boy who doubled as a personal valet. "I'm sure to be out until very late. If you hear a noise in the night, don't be concerned." The next day, Paris was waking up. The office boy was entering when he noticed the door was open and inside no sign of Rivière. Came opening time and still no sign of him. A lot of people came to withdraw money as usual and the money was starting to run out at the cashiers. In the absence of Rivière, they decided to go to the vault to get more. Inside the vault, they only found a note that said, "I have been summoned by the police. My state of health and advanced age prevent me from resisting this harassment. I have been grossly insulted. I therefore tender my resignation. I am handing over the cash in my possession to my successor, who will arrive at midday." The manager, white as a sheet, told the workers to stop accepting any more applications and waited until noon. But when noon came and no one showed up, they called the police. Of course, Wells was already on his way to England. The interview with the inspector frightened them. He had no idea the police were already investigating. He thought he still had a little bit more time before leaving France, but he managed to keep his cool during the interview, like when he did back at the Monte Carlo table. Wells disappeared with 4.5 million pounds in today's money. This time he got away before it was too late. During the 6 months he did this scam, he traveled a lot between France and England, going to deposit the cash in England. But now it was a one-way trip. The police circled around clues that always ended up with Rivière, and Rivière didn't exist anymore. This time, Charles DeVille Wells managed to really break the bank. The next day, he was turning 70, so this was the perfect way to finally retire. In Paris, people were gathering around Rente Bimensuelle. By word of mouth, almost everyone knew what happened faster than the newspapers. A man that still didn't know was showing up there to invest when he found an old military who was wanting to shoot Wells with his 6-shooter, 1 bullet for every 1,000 francs he owed him. An old lady was saying they shouldn't have trusted them because they were always too polite. But some people still trusted that Rivière would come back. This was the fault of the big banks, that they couldn't compete and force him out, that he was a good man. Of course, the people who invested first managed to get some money, but as you know, that's the way these scams work. Among the crowds, there were conmen trying to pick up the breadcrumbs, luring them to their schemes. Nobody knew anything about Rivière. The Criminal Investigation Department, or CID, investigated the documents and confirmed that he actually disappeared with 7 million pounds. At this time, the police were getting a lot more sophisticated. They had photographs and fingerprints and created a system to keep records of criminals. They followed the trail of his fake names until finally one of his nieces identified him as Charles Wells. That's when the Scotland Yard also got involved. They matched the fingerprints from Rivière to Davenport. This was getting to be an important case, so So the CID put Detective Sergeant George Nichols in charge of the investigation. He symbolized a new generation of police that use forensic science to help them. They recently caught Dr. Rippen, the first criminal caught because of the wireless telegraphy, so they had experience tracking down guys that moved around. George Nichols began by making a biography of Charles Wells, but on the night of the 21st to the 22nd of August 1911, 4 months after Ribier disappeared, La Gioconda was told. The Sûreté Nationale shifted all their efforts to find and put Wells on hold. The painting appeared 2 years later when a thief gave her back. Then they continued hunting Wells with double the effort. They needed to improve their public image after the failure of the Mona Lisa. They finally had a breakthrough when they found the records of Wells's marriage and then found his wife and daughter. They kept an eye on them, but at a distance, seeing where the mail came from until they found registered letters coming from London. They figured he was sending them money, but they couldn't open the letters. It would have raised suspicion. After escaping to England, Wells bought the Harbinger yacht and renamed him Excelsior. Then he settled in Falmouth, which had a very busy port with a lot of activity, but still a relatively small population. Wells and Jeanette spent most of their time on the yacht, which he renovated to bring Jeanette every comfort she needed. He even invented a machine to help her fishing. The Excelsior was a smaller version of the vision that he had for the Palais Royal. It was the floating palace he had promised her. The locals liked the unusual couple. Mr. Deville had a reputation of a kind and old gent. He spoke English with a slight foreign accent and was almost always wearing a yachting cap, so for that he was nicknamed the French Captain. They lived as millionaires, yacht owners, spending a lot of money. When they were not hunting fowl or fishing, they came ashore and usually watched the play, concert, or even the new moving pictures. The police were also keeping an eye on Jeanette's sister, Leonie, and intercepted a letter sent from him to her. They managed to establish that the manufacturer of the envelope was in London, and looking around, they managed to track some parcels that were being sent to C. Deville in Falmouth. So Inspector Roux got the midnight train and went straight to Falmouth. He got there all tired, befriended a local policeman, and they walked around looking for Wells on one side of town, while Wells was on another. Finally, they decided to visit the yacht. And yes, I lied to you at the beginning of the video. It was Inspector Roux that got eyes Wells on the boat 9 months after he interviewed him in Paris. Nichols found them already in custody the day after. They gave them time to dress up before going, with his dapper cap and fashionable greased trousers on the side, but Wells was looking somber. Jeanette said to the captain, "Keep the yacht clean. We'll be back in a day or two." A crowd of people formed, chanting the song while they were being taken away by train. Then started a 4-month battle between the French and British government to decide where he would stand trial. But after 4 months, they decided to go with the extradition to France. 13 months for Jeanette, 5 years for Wells. They also ended up deciding to split the money Wells had between the British and French victims, so even Miss Fillmore and Trent finally got some money back. Before the start of the Great War, Wells was already outside, but this time, no journalists, no public, no one was interested in seeing him. He was old and living with the little money that the French government gave him from the annuities. In 1919, he threatened to 404 himself. The cost of living had increased a lot because of the war, and he couldn't sustain himself. They had all the interest in keeping him alive, so that the victims could also keep receiving the annuities, so they gave him £260 per year, the equivalent of a skilled worker's salary. With that money, he could go on living in relative comfort until late July 1922, Monte Carlo Wells died. The Dartmoor prison governor had this to say about his death.
Monte Carlo Wells is dead. A man with such a temperament ought to have been immortal. He ought not even to have grown old. I am quite sure it was his bodily machine that wore out, and that his spirit was invested with perennial youth.
News broke that the man who robbed the bank at Monte Carlo died poor and alone in Paris. But that was not true. He was living in London next to Jeanette in a middle-class neighborhood, so it was okay. He was buried there in London, but because they didn't know if he had any relatives, they buried him in an unmarked grave. And also, Jeanette probably didn't have enough money for a headstone. That shit's expensive. The end. Listen, how did Charles win? Wait. Before going to our conspiracy theories, I have to credit the guy that wrote this story. The guy is Robin Quinn. So if you like this story, go to his website and buy his book on Amazon. Buy the audiobook on Audible. The first time I read the book was on Audible when I was coming and going to work. The book is really well written. All that juicy details that
He was the one that did the legwork, actually going outside his house to find the newspapers, find correspondence. He should get all that credit. I just repurposed the book for the script for this video. I just added stupid jokes and some other things. So please, if you like the story, go buy the book. If you like the video, you can join the cult on Patreon, or if you want to do a single donation, you can do it on Ko-fi. Yeah, the first time I heard of Charles Wells was because of the song, The Man Who Broke the Bank at Monte Carlo. I heard the music on Lawrence of Arabia. Since that movie came out, I guess most people know of the song because of that movie. And around 2013, I already had an idea to make a video about this, about the story, about the music. I wanted to do sort of an animation, like a music video for the song. I don't know, I really didn't know how to do it. The only information I could find was a few lines on Wikipedia. No one had compiled all the information we got in the book that came out in, I think, 2016. I just kept postponing this video. Like I said at the beginning, it's been 6 months of consuming a lot of yerba mate, just working on this. Sorry about the audio quality for a large part of the video. I already know how to fix some of the mistakes for the next video, so subscribe. How did Charles want so much? There's a theory that this was all just a publicity stunt. We know that Camille Blanc was scared that the contract with the Prince of Monaco was running out. The theory is that somehow Charles Wells made a connection with Camille Blanc, and both of them conspired to attract attention to the casino to get more gamblers. Nothing really that far-fetched. One way they could have done it is just a known faulty wheel. The tolerances they could build a roulette wheel at the time were not like today, so especially the casino, they knew if one of the wheels favored some numbers, they could even prepare the wheel for Charles and say to him, if you bet on these specific numbers on this wheel and just keep on betting, you'll end up winning. And the whole shtick of the breaking the bank, oh my god, there's no more money at the table, we have to get more. That's really easy to do if you got like 20 people around the table betting on the same thing. If they win, it's not that difficult to break the bank. Oh my god, he broke the bank. We know that Francois Blanc opened the casino with fraudulent money, so it's easy to imagine that Camille Blanc did everything he could to keep the casino open, just like his father did. Remember that the casino had a £1 million budget to silence newspaper stories. And also, do you remember that Charles was looking for £6,000 before going to Monte Carlo, and mysteriously he didn't need the £6,000 anymore? Where did he get the money? When they asked him in court, he always refused to say who this mysterious backer was. And also about the breaking the bank thing, there's reports of guys doing that before Charles. But some reporters even said that they saw them doing the whole black cloth over the table because they broke the bank. But the reporters could see that there was still money on the table. That was just for show. And also the first time that Wells won, they only called a local Reuters reporter. When the reporter arrived, he was gone, but second time Wells came, there were a lot of reporters, and that coincided with the opening of a new gaming room on the casino, the Salle Touzé. The whole thing was probably just a stunt to just promote the opening. The problem was when the newspaper started finding out about the Charles Wells scams. When you start reporting that Monte Carlo Wells is the Charles Wells fraudster, that was bad for business, for the casino business. When the newspapers started to report on Wells, Camille Blanc found out really quick because he had spies all over the major European cities, and he already had a casino full of gamblers, so he didn't need Charles anymore. So if Camille and Charles had a deal, when he came in January for the third time, the deal probably was already off the table. So that's probably why Camille Blanc was at the table. He was trying to tell Wells he was no longer welcome there. And also, I think it was one of the bankruptcy court hearings. He said he won £60,000 and had to give back 2/3 of the winnings. Just kept 20,000. He didn't say the name of the backer. He knew that Camille Blanc had eyes everywhere, so if he said his name, he probably had to deal with the consequences later. And also, the shares of the casino that he bought were probably just like a thank you gift from Camille Blanc for a job well done.
sort of thing. Yeah, after the Monte Carlo well stunt, the shares that Camille Blanc had on the casino, they now were worth 120 million pounds. So yeah, there was high incentive to do this kind of things.
I just told all these people's faces. These are from some of my favorite YouTubers. Please forgive me and let me tell you, I didn't ask permission to anyone. I just went ahead and stole all these famous people's faces.